turn that off. And then we'll continue to let people in. So I want to say hello to everybody. I'm Jill Phillips with the Washington Studio School. And I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for the 5th in our series of conversations between artists this year. I especially want to welcome Mojdeh and Latrelle. Those of you that have been joining us know that these conversations have been intentionally designed as unmoderated and unfiltered dialogues between two artists, some of whom knew each other previously and some of whom just met while preparing for their conversations, as the case is with this one. The conversations have all been terrific. They've been full of surprises and wisdom and questions presented in the very natural and informal way that occurs in a studio visit between two artists. As is the case with all of our free to the public events, they are able to happen in part because of the generous support of the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, the Joanne Shorey Legacy Fund, and numerous other individual donors. And we are grateful for that support, and we want to say thank you to all. We are extremely excited about this evening's conversation because it pushes the boundaries of materials and space and concept and intent outside of the world of painting. Most of the previous conversations have been between painters, and many of us are painters and we love painters, but neither of tonight's artists are painters specifically. As you'll see, the work of both Mojdeh Rezaeipour and Latrelle Rostant is autobiographical. They're self-portraits in a sense, but their use of space and materials and technology and the intersection of time and experience and memory come together in each of their work in ways that are urgent and particular to their own piecing together of diasporic identity. There is so much to say about each artist and their work, but the point is for you to learn that from them. They'll be in dialogue with each other for an hour or a little more, and then we'll take questions at the end, which you can send through the chat at any point. But in brief introduction, let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Latrelle Rostant was born in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and in her early teens, she immigrated to the States with her mother. She's currently based in Maryland outside of Washington, DC. She studied textiles at Rhode Island School of Design, and after graduating and spending time in that field, she returned to RISD a few years later to study architecture. She then pursued her MFA in fiber and materials at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Through woven textiles made on a modular loom that she needed to design herself, and which, by the way, is a constantly evolving and exquisite work of art in itself, Rostant explores what it means to be too foreign for the place she comes from and the place she now occupies. She's been awarded several artist residencies, including at the Vermont Studio Center and recently at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. Her work, both textile and the tool it was made on, was exhibited last year at Target Gallery's 2020 Emerging Artist Exhibition here in Alexandria, Virginia. She has an upcoming residency at Triangle Arts Association in Dumbo, New York, and will be teaching at RISD in the textile department this fall. Mojdeh Rezaeipour is an Iranian-American artist and storyteller based in Washington, DC. Her move to this country also occurred in her early teens. Her mixed media works and installations explore hyphenated identity and belonging, as well as the intersections of our collective striving for healing and transformation. After completing her architectural studies at UC Berkeley, Mojdeh's involvement in art and design has taken her to San Francisco, New York, Rome, Tokyo, and Berlin, where she spent the summer of 2018 on an arts fellowship awarded by the Studio Visit. Her exhibitions locally and internationally have been featured in publications such as The Rib, Dirt, So to Speak, Baltimore Art, and The Washington Post. Her stories have been aired on the Moth Radio Hour on NPR, and she served as the Moth's Washington, DC Story Slam producer from 2015 through 2018. She was the Nicholson Project Artist in Residence in 2020 and received a Wherewithal Research Grant for 2020-2021. Mojdeh is a resident artist at Stable Arts, is currently a VisArts Studio Fellow, where her ongoing collaborative installation Formations of a Diasporic Body is viewable until August 8th, and will be an upcoming artist in residence at Wesley Theological Seminary. We are incredibly delighted to welcome these two phenomenal artists, and I'll turn it over to the two of them until we are ready for some questions at the end of their conversation, which I know you will enjoy immensely. Thank you. It's all yours.
So thank you everyone for coming. So I think we decided, we spoke before, and I think we decided to really start off at the point where we both sort of has a important part, and it's revealing its way in different ways to us as we move along, and that's architecture. For me, after studying textiles, I decided to go into to study architecture, and I sort of made this connection between those of they're both creating spaces in which people occupy in different ways, and it's sort of this materiality that sort of combines to make these objects, and sort of how sight sort of plays in an important part with the making. And that's initially why I went into architecture. How about you? Was it something that, what was the thing that like prompted you to study architecture?
Yeah, thank you also Washington Studio School, Latrelle, and Jill for that wonderful introduction. Really happy to be here today and be in conversation with you, Latrelle. For me, architecture, like choosing to do architecture, like making a lot of decisions in my life, can be kind of random. I've forever been like a student of surrender, and the ways that I make decisions are kind of based on what happens in my life at that moment. And when it was time to choose what I wanted to study, where I wanted to apply to go to college, I was doing homework with a friend of mine from high school, and I was like, I really don't know what I want to do or what major I want to apply for. I find that it's kind of funny that we are, as a society, like expecting 18-year-olds to make a decision for what they want to do for the rest of their life, And so my friend was like, well, Mojdeh, you're really creative and you're great at math, so you should become an architect. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Like, I liked Legos growing up, I'll apply for architecture. And I applied for a lot of different things. I also applied to like become a pharmacist because someone told me it would be good. I tried a lot of different things, and then I got into Berkeley and really liked their campus, and I wanted to kind of go off on my own and be in California, like away from my family here, who then actually, in order to get in-state tuition, followed me across the country and lived like an hour away. So it ended up being kind of funny, but yeah, like I guess what about architecture school sticks out to you as something that you're still carrying forward in your practice as an artist, Latrelle?
For me, architecture, it's complicated. I feel it continues to be complicated. I think I went in with a lot of excitement and sort of these theories about what it was going to be, and what I thought it was and what it actually entailed were two different things. And I think for me, it's sort of, I was coming from textiles, which was this sort of way of making, which it's very tactile in a way. You're very hands-on with the materials you're making. You're tactile in a different way in architecture. And, when you work, like the scale is different in terms of working, and the approach to making, they tend to veer at different points, with, you're making, but you're thinking about, you're imagining how others would interact with these things that you're making, and you're making in a way in which for both, you're making, especially if you go into design in terms of textiles, but when you go into the design field of architecture, you're making these things in which you have to imagine how others would use them, but also there's all these other laws that come into play, with these buildings. And then, for me, by the time I graduated, I think I was a little burnt out, because the structure of the curriculum, it requires so much out of you. And
It's a way of life, really.
yeah,
It's not like a major, it's a way of life. People
yeah,
live in their studios.
yeah. And which, I think I have the same sort of mindset when it comes to my studio, but I felt, I just got to a point where I was like, I can't do this for my career. Like, the idea of continuing that and making it that way, in which, you know like, you have to, like, when you think of great architects, you don't they're the projects that they're known for, how do you imprint yourself on this making, that you sort of start and realize that it's not really the things you want to explore, and the things you want to do are predetermined in a way that you can't break free from them. And I just got to a point where I was the end, I was on fumes, and I was like, no, this isn't it. I didn't have, like, I had classmates who were like, architecture was their thing. They were going to graduate and, figure it out. And I was like, this isn't it for me. And it sort of led me to even double back to textiles. And, it wasn't until I got out from the architecture department that I sort of started to relook at a lot of the things and ways I was taught. And that sort of led me down this rabbit hole that I'm still trying to figure out where I'm going, but it's an enjoyable ride. I don't know. How does architecture come up in your work? Because a lot of your work is like site specific, like not site specific. That's like the site is an important part of the
A lot of it is, it is site specific. I just want to go back to something you said, just what even is a great architect, like there's so many, like in my experience at Berkeley, it was just like this formal obsession with like iterative thinking, moving from, I don't know, studying the movements of a butterfly to then making a diagram that then informed how you like how you move through a space in your design. And then but like a lot of that can be pretty disconnected from like human experience,
Mhm.
and just like on the page. And for me, the most meaningful experience in architecture school was when a group of 14 of us did our thesis in Rome, and we were studying this kilometer-long public housing complex in the periphery of the city. And we were like a group of kids from California flying to a foreign country and trying to redesign these people's homes because it's like needs to be redesigned. And for me, I was just like, that's something about that just didn't feel right. And so I just like started to go there a lot, and little by little meet the people who live there, have conversations with them. And and at the end, my presentation back home was like photos taken like really zoomed out of the building in the daytime and at nighttime, and then reseeding the building elements and kind of letting the human interferences come forward and having portraits of the residents that live there that I had conversations with, like how they knew each other, diagrams. And for me, that was like, oh, I'm saying goodbye to architecture. I don't care. That's what I'm doing. But there was this grad student that walked by and he kind of looked at it and he's like, this is your thesis? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, this is the kind of architecture that we need to see more of in the world. I was like, what? What do you mean? Like, this is my goodbye to architecture. But really the best architecture, I think, is architecture that really considers what people's experience is going to be like, and also works with the communities and centering the communities that it's like coming to interact with. But yeah, the iterative thinking is something that I take forward in my practice from architecture, just kind of thinking about things in iterations. But I am going to share, oops, sorry. There we go. Yes. I wanted to talk about iteration in your work, Latrelle. Something that's really fascinating about your work to me is just the ways in which these different looms and each iteration of the looms inform the work that you make on them. And then once you make the work, the iterations of the work kind of coming off the loom and then like folding onto itself. And yeah, so could you speak a little bit to that process?
Yeah, so the process of the loom, there came to a point when I was making where I'll discuss this further later, but the tool is a necessary part for this object to be made. And, you know, there came the point where these objects are being made, and I'm at the thinking now of, you know, trying to understand what happens to these objects, because what happens to these objects while they're being made on this tool, and what happens to these objects when they're off the tool, and what does that speak to in terms of me, the maker, versus who's interacting with these objects after I'm no longer in the space. And it sort of is tied to my understanding, expectations of culture, and sort of, you know, why do we have these expectations of culture and many other things for them to sort of be stuck or hold on to forms that don't really make sense or speak to who we are today. And sort of this idea of, you know, how I interact with it is very different from someone else who's interact with it. Like, everyone's interaction is different, but yet it's the same, it has the same general form, but the form itself sort of collapses onto itself. It expands. It can be put together in different ways. And for me, I'm gonna go and share my screen right now just to give a bit of a context to this. Let's see. Okay. Here we are. So I hope you all can see the screen. Oops. So for me, a lot of the work I keep making comes back to this poem, and it's so you're here, so here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. So after my time at RISD the second time, I sort of started weaving again, and very quickly I became not bored, but very disinterested in sort of the ways I had been taught to learn. And I started making these weavings that were very dimensional, and it came to a point where I was trying to figure out why I was making this way, why I was forcing a tool to make in a way that it was not meant to be made upon. And I decided to pursue my MFA. And for me, my whole time there was sort of split sort of working on two questions. The first question was like, why was I making this way? Why was I making a tool, these tools for weaving, sort of make these very dimensional objects? And then also I wanted to understand how this way of making is tied to my understanding of self as someone who has spent more time in the States than I did in the country where I was born, the culture that sort of represents who I am. And for me, it was just sort of these makings of these woven objects. And I had these looms made, these wooden looms, and I got to a point where I was making on them, and I got to a point where it's like, in order to me to make this object that I want to make, I have to design this tool for making. And for me, it was just sort of like the light went on, and I sort of, I had this multi-beam tool, and I was having someone else make these tools. And by the time I got the looms, it was very apparent that they were not working in the manner that I wanted them to work, which led me to realize that like I had to make this tool. So I started making these iterations of this modular loom that sort of led to the work that you showed, where, I was looking at this tool and trying to make these objects, and sort of at the same time I'm making this tool and making these objects, but I was like, what are these two things? What is this tool and what is this object that I'm making? That, one they need each other to exist. The object cannot exist without this tool. So as I went through this process, there was a lot of experimentation and sort of looking at what I needed the tool to do and trying to figure out how to get this tool to sort of um, come together. And I went to this talk by Najeka Cosby, and she was talking about her own work. She's a painter, and she talked in her talk, she talked about culture and talked about how the expectation of culture in Nigeria has sort of become this Venn diagram of Nigerian culture before the British came and Nigerian culture after the British came, and what happened while they were there. And the culture was sort of like these coming together of these circles in which culture now was sort of a taking of what they knew versus the mixing of the different cultural groups within Nigeria. So they made a culture that represented them. And for me, looking at these objects and sort of questioning how I understood myself within the context of living in the States, I sort of understood sort of like the taking up space and these tools, sort of looking at how I understood myself as this person who occupies space in different ways. And these woven objects became sort of like, how we interact with culture and our expectations of culture, and how through my own living, I, in a way, become a tourist of my own culture, in which I was expecting things to be the same and they weren't. And sort of how do I take, and this tool and the objects I make are sort of a way of looking at that and sort of trying to understand of like, I have a certain understanding of this process of making while I'm making, but what happens when these objects are off the loom? And during the time since during the time of the pandemic till now, I haven't been able to make at the scale that I used to make. So it's sort of, I've sort of refocused on all the objects themselves, and like, what are these objects that are being made, and like, how are they understood or situated without the tool when they're next to the tool, and how we sort of look at objects within the spaces of cultural institutions and really trying to understand, do we understand how to contextualize what we're seeing? But what happens, when we interact with these objects, we have to take what someone else has told us what they are. So what does that mean if every time I show it, it's slightly different? Like, do you understand that? So it's like a lot of the work I'm doing right now is sort of trying to understand what are these objects, and what is this desire I have to sort of really make this way and make these objects these way. And sort of, I hope that in the future, I'll have more space to sort of really push this further, but this is kind of where the work is right now. But, I think, let me escape this. One of the things I really want to sort of circle back and talk about is your work.
Wait, can I just say something? I really enjoyed hearing about all of that, and I just feel that your process is such an elegant articulation of the diasporic, like the complexities of diasporic experience and identity. And I love that, in when seeing when feeling a lack for a tool with which to create what it is you're needing to create, you've created that tool, and thereby a conversation between like the tool and your creation. And so
Mhm.
I just find that really beautiful. And yeah.
Yeah, it's making it's so weird. Because at times I've had major doubt in terms of making, because I'm like, I'm making it this way, and I look out and I don't really see anyone who's making it this way. And I listened to Barbara Chase Rubbound. She's a sculptor, and she lives in France right now, but she's American. And in her talk, she spoke about, she said something that I was like, that is it, because she has a making practice and a writing practice, and she said that I I write what I cannot make, and I make what I cannot write. And I
Mm,
felt that, like, that
wow, I love
really touched something within me, because I'm like, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to make something, these objects, I'm trying to make something that I I don't know how to write about them, but I can only understand them through making them. Through the making is where I am able to sort of be like, ooh, this is right and this is wrong. And it sort of speaks to how you've spoken before of how you're sort of like you make, you when you make, you know how to sort of how things come together, and how like when you cite when your works are cited, there are all these objects that are coming together, but you know instinctually through your intuition that that is the right the right move for those objects, how they sort of come together. And I've selected these works because they're sort of the works that sort of lead into your video work, I think. um because you know a lot of your work was like, this work is about material exploration, about what did I write, sort of duality that's happening, sort of the deconstruction, sort of the coming together. Yeah, so can you like maybe expand upon that, and sort of you can start speaking about it, and I'll stop sharing, and you could like show
yeah,
us your work.
yeah, let me share. um so So yeah, I guess important to know about me is that, well, you already heard that I lived in Iran until I was 12 and immigrated to the US at that point with my family. But also Iran is an Islamic republic, so the way that my life looked at home looked was really different than the way that it looked at school. And like that duality is something that, um, I have been healing, myself from, or like kind of that experience of duality in childhood, of like separating into two distinctly like opposite selves, to survive in society, which I think a lot of people have experience with in different contexts. But yeah, so that's one thing that's important to know. And then the other thing is that I lived and worked on, inside of this little geodesic dome, on a large piece of Piscataway forest in southern Maryland for some time. And so like materially a lot of, natural elements make their way into my work. Um, and yeah, I in terms of site specific installations, to answer your question, I started out, working with a lot of archival material from my childhood, kind of deconstructing them and reconstructing them in this act of healing myself, through time. And then I felt a need to like create these worlds to wherein I would use that body of 2D and sculptural work as a sort of vocabulary to tell my own story and also to kind of create containers for collective stories. And the way that that would work is basically I would have a few pieces of finished work, like for example, like these, and then I would go into a space with a couple more boxes of things, and over the course of like 2 days to 7 days, just create an installation to show those works inside of. And then in early 2020, before COVID, I had an exhibition in Berlin with my partner, and for that show, because we were traveling and like this kind of process of bringing a few boxes of things and making it up as you go along was a little bit more difficult. I leaned more on video components of the work, and that kind of surprised me in the way that it felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, where my work a lot of times maybe didn't make sense to a lot of people, but then like having the video enveloped inside of it helps kind of fill in the gaps. And yeah, and then through the pandemic, I did a few different projects, but I I was invited to be part of this show that Syndicate curated at Tefra Institute for Contemporary Art in Reston, Virginia. And for that exhibition, artists were invited to create to return to an old work with a new eye. It was called An Excellent Thought About a Quality Idea. And I decided to return to some childhood drawings that my mom had kept for me throughout the years from when I was like 4 to 9, and brought across the world to here when we moved here. And so in that process, I created objects out of my old drawings, created installations out of the drawings, and then I animated the drawings through stop motion, also like just projections and things like that, and then interacted with that. And so this is kind of a new methodology I've been exploring, and I want to play this video for you all. Anyway, so you sort of see. But yeah, I also, to return to something else you said about the artist, I forget their name now, but you're talking about going between different concentrations in your practice. So like from writing to making, and finding these different spaces in your practice to keep pushing yourself in different ways, or like to hide inside of, to like to tend to something you might not want to be like dealing with in the other part of your practice, and like informing each other. This past year for me has been a lot about grounding my work in connective research a little bit more, and also working a little bit more collaboratively, and being more intentional about how my work can become a container for other people to explore like their stories as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about this research project that I've been working on, just not too long, but just a little bit. And so in early 2020, I had a studio visit from a director of the local institution who, because we were talking about kind of the material memory and the ways in which I interact with objects that carry a story or a sense of place within them in my installations. You mentioned that there happens to be a box of ancient pottery fragments in their HVAC room collecting dust. And if I wanted to work with them, and they're from Iran. And so I was really excited. And by the time that pandemic kind of became like, we became used to it enough that we could meet up with someone to get a box. Over the summer, I got them finally after hearing about them, and recognized that actually they're not all from Iran. On the back of them, it says all the sites, and they're from like 30 different sites across the Middle East. And so pretty soon it started to feel more like a responsibility than like a perk. I was like, wow, this is, I just like laid them on the side of my studio, like you see here, and just kind of let them sit there for a few days and tell me what it is that I should do with them. And throughout that time, I started thinking a lot like, who do these actually belong to? How can they be used as a bridge to across time and space, or like across a lost sense of connection? And who do they have the potential to bring together? So like, I was pretty clear on the fact that I don't want to work on these myself, but instead to use them as an excuse to get in touch with a group of other artists and thinkers and humans, like with lineage across all of these sites across the Middle East and places like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and kind of start a series of conversations, and then together decide what it is that we want to do with them. And then I found I was on the Smithsonian website for another reason. I found some other fragments that look like they might be missing pieces of the same vessels. And then I started getting obsessed about this question of like, what becomes possible when two or more broken pieces of the same pottery piece like find each other on the opposite side of the world. And then I started thinking about going inside of different institutions and kind of like reclaiming some of those pieces, like if they weren't wanted, which oftentimes they're not, and otherwise just like creating an archive of them. And throughout that process, I was preparing for my current show at Rezaeipour, and for my own kind of piece, like thinking so much about 4,000 years ago, which is where some of these fragments are from, led me to think a lot about my Zoroastrian ancestors. And just this, Zoroastrianism is the ancient religion in Iran, and it's one of the first monotheistic religions in the world. It informs a lot of modern day religions. And so in Zoroastrianism, folks worship God in the form of fire. And there are fires that have been burning for thousands of years in various temples inside of Iran. And so I started getting obsessed about this ancient 1,500-year-old fire and wanting to commune with it. And so studying looking at all these different temples and burning them onto wood. And then slowly I started to take videos of my own body in movement, and then kind of cutting my head out for some reason. And then little by little, I realized I'm depicting not just like my body, but like the collective diasporic body. And I'm trying to attempt this pilgrimage across time and space to these ancestral lands. And, also feels connected to something you're saying, like legacies of colonialism and imperialism have shattered geographies and peoples. And, a lot of us feel like from the Middle East, especially, or from the Middle East, in my experience is what I'm saying, feel really disconnected from homeland, feel really disconnected from each other, feel disconnected from ourselves in certain ways. And so I decided this was more than just for me. And so why not, this is the wrong, So this was like more than just for me. And so I invited like 6 other Iranian artists to kind of join me in on this and send me videos on themselves, and they're cutting all of our heads off. And then together we do this pilgrimage. And then I just kind of work with that same stop motion methodology and making this film, this immersive film that is also iterative and like is evolving as it goes on, but is up right now. And I'll play a little video of the installation, but you can visit it. Yeah, so you can see that at Viz Arts. But yeah, it's so that room for me right now is this playground and laboratory for like the felt branch of the research, which brings back to what I was trying to say, which is like, you know, you can kind of have conversations with other people, like learn about the sites of the fragments, like go inside institutions, build relationships to like make something happen. But then this is now the core of it for me, to where just like asking for folks to offer more fragments of like movement and feeling and words and sound and different things, and then sort of layering them inside of the container that I made, you know, like your looms, like for this experiment, is, yeah, it's kind of like where the work is for me, and kind of going back and forth between those two things feels healthy.
Yeah, because you're reciting. No, you're taking these objects and putting them back into these sites that they're no longer. They've been sort of they no longer exist in. So it's sort of, and the thing about it, since they're fragments, they exist in other places.
Right.
So it's sort of, you know, I had this thought today, and I don't know where it came from or where it's going, but sort of this idea of sort of thinking about how we know self or object, how we perceive others, how others perceive self or object, or how, and what the object actually is. And sort of, you know, when we come in contact with these objects, we try to contextualize them within how we know things. And I find it interesting that how you were given this box, and there's sort of the person who was giving the box made the, like, had the knowledge of thinking they all, since there were all these fragments and they all were in this container, they were all the same. But actually, when you go into it and you interacted with it, you learned that that was not true. Like, this object exists from many different places, from many different sites. And then on further pulling back, you realize that this was part of something else that exists elsewhere, but where it exists is in like this, in these institutions where sort of like these assumptions are made about them, but they're not fully fleshed out. And they're not fleshed out by people who made them, or who are in context or conversation from those places. So they're imagining what these things are, but there's so much more. And I
they're
keep
and defining what those things are too, you know?
Yeah.
Like, it's in their possession, and it's a really tricky thing to navigate conversation with or within an institution, like to whom your culture is an object, you know? And yeah, so it's complicated.
Yeah, I keep having these, like, I'm watching all these Marvel shows, but it's like we we all have been informed and told that there's a specific understanding of how history evolved, but actually history is like a multiverse. There's many things happening, but there's these factors that want to control and tell us that things are this particular way. And I think for us as makers, you sort of like, but there's so much more than what I'm being contextualized within, and how do I sort of subvert these meanings that are being placed upon me in a way that I'm allowed space to sort of actually figure out these fragments of myself that are scattered globally in context to where I am now. So yeah, it's this conversation that there's no fixed answer, because there's no record was kept, no central, the chapters are only one chapter, and you can't really go beyond the pages of what is written now, because the record wasn't kept. So we're in this space of making where almost we can sort of, what am I trying to say? Sort of placed upon it what we think and what we know, what our intuition tells us what it should be. Yeah. 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 I mean, are the other artists, are they doing research on the objects also, or are they just sort of responding to those objects?
So it's interesting. The collaborative project that's up at Viz Arts now is not like directly off of the fragments. I found out afterwards that these two are related, and in fact that's another branch of the same thing. However, my goal with the fragments and the artists is to combine the two, and so I'm planning on spending the next year or two creating a sort of like central research seed for us, including an archive of where all of the fragments live in different institutions, or not all of them, but like however many I'm able to archive. And also to raise funds in order to invite everyone into imagining a collective project, and then to mail everyone the fragments, like physically, like a couple pieces a person or something, and then inviting them, and then with hopefully like a check, and then inviting them to just be with the fragments for a certain period of time, and then come together to have a more of a collective conversation. So far, I've been connecting one-on-one with folks, and I've connected with like 20 something people, but there are 93 fragments in this specific collection, and it's my intention to connect with 93 people all in all, because we are the fragments, as you were saying. It's like dealing with this like diasporic clay. So like bringing like this diasporic clay and like these diasporic humans together. And there are pieces of this research that already existed in my life, and I just had to like pay attention, like squint a little bit. It's like the people who are already in my life, which are 6 of whom are these. I mean, I think everyone's an artist, so yes, 6 artists, but like 6 humans, like healers, teachers, musicians, into this project. And yeah, because it's together that we can piece the feeling of it better. So I'm really excited about that. But
yeah, it's also interesting in sort of the journeys and distance and time, because you discovered these objects, but they were taken from these places at a specific time, and then they were made in a specific time. So it's just sort of like time keeps folding each time they get interacted with.
right.
So it'll be interesting to see how the people who get to interact with them sort of, how they approach these objects, because some people become a diving board into like more research about what they are, or somebody might become, I imagine, sort of like, how do you incorporate something from the past, but into your what you know today? Like, how do you like reimagine it or recontextualize it so it has purpose for now?
Mm. Yeah, and like every time I talk to someone, the inquiry itself like deepens so much because everyone's kind of thinks about it in so many different ways, as you just said. And um, actually, we were going to talk a little bit about the books that we're kind of reading right now and looking into, and this feels related. I was talking to another local or a local Palestinian American artist who's based here, Fargo Bahi, and he was mentioning he recommended this book to me, which has completely been blowing my mind. It's called Rubble by the author's name is Gaston Gordillo, and it's kind of a reframing of the concept of ruins as these objects or spaces that are fetishized for their pastness, to the concept of rubble, which is like something much more complex and layered, and is connected to the history of itself via like people who live close by, who have like generational relationship with this space, and also as not disconnected from the sort of debris of environmental degradation. So for example, the soy farms that are kind of taking over in Argentina, and like the rubble that's kind of coming off of those. And yeah, so that's been really interesting. But
Oh, that's interesting.
what are you reading, Latrelle?
Well, it's sort of this idea. I've read a couple of things, but two of the books I want to highlight, sort of what you just said about the generational relationship to space. I read this book. It's called The Deep by Rivers Solomon. And it's this book about African mermaids who were initially women who were pregnant, and they were thrown overboard, and the children they had sort of became these mermaids. But it focuses on a character who is struggling with they're sort of a person who holds all the memories, and they're struggling with that responsibility and what does it mean, and they want to escape it. And it's a really interesting book because it's sort of when you leave and you look back in longing, but when you're there, like, it made me really think about, what is the weight of having to carry on something in terms of, the living a life in which so many outside things are pushing in against you, but you're sort of trying to hold on to these things of the past that sort of have difficulty in terms of how they're situated in today's world. And it was just like it was a really great book. It's not that long, but it's like just sort of like the struggle that the character had. And the other book I'm reading, which it's a reread, it's called What Color is Sacred by Michael Tusig, I think. And this book is amazing because it's sort of like, when I read it, I think about how when you pursue art or there's these general ideas that we take on thinking about color, but within this book they're sort of sussing out and really trying to understand, how color was sort of looked at different points through Indigenous communities versus European communities, and how one way of thinking and approaching color sort of took over, and how sort of this search for replicating these natural colors led to this whole chemical industry, and how we sort of understand and look at color. And it's incredibly fascinating. Like, it has these like chapters and verses that I'm just sort of like, oh, I never,
Something from it.
let me see. It's wait. Let me see. There's so many things
If it doesn't feel right now, too, you don't have to. But I figure if you have a favorite thing.
Okay, here's this is from chapter 9, but chapter 8 is also good. It says, some quite other medium, you want to say, when all along you had thought it was color, just color, good old color, useful for wrapping up reality as a gift. Some quite other medium, but what could it be? This curious likeness that floats, that passes, that radiates across the valley like a breath of dying sun. What could it be? Is it a substance or is it and color? What is something out there in the extra personal world? Or is it merely part of a human imagination? Or could it be all these things? And such questions are irrelevant as color mocks our usual categories of understanding. Like, this book is phenomenal. It's just sort of like, because within my own work, I made a decision early. Like, I've made work with color, but the majority of the things I make are sort of this this natural cotton. And I realized early on that when people see color, you immediately associate it with something. You immediately, it triggers something in your mind. And I really wanted my work to sort of, at this point, to be really about, figuring out the tool and figuring out what these objects are. Because once you start introducing color, the object, like what happens to the object when it becomes like these bright colors, or the like what meanings are further put on it that aren't my intent. So like reading that book, like rereading this book is so, it just makes you think about, the objects that are around us and how we sort of, live in these homes where, everything is sort of like these, creams and browns. Well, so for some people, not many people, and like really, how we as a world, well, not in all places, but in sort of in some places, how we had this like, this aversion to bright colors, and why is that? And is that something that we've taken on, or we've been told, what is the correct color palette? What is, why the need to sort of, take on the hierarchy of like monochrome colors being like the way to go versus having, these brightly colored colors that surround us. And when things are brightly colored, why do some of us have this aversion, or think we need to have this aversion to it? And this book is so good. It just sort of like make you really step back and be like, oh, color can be used, there's color in nature, and then there's versus how we sort of as a society, as people, sort of have this drive to replicate it even though we can't. And just sort of looking at it as a whole and globally, it's just been, this book is like really good at doing that. I really like A1.
Yay.
Yeah. But yeah, because I was recommended to read it in passing by someone, and I was like, oh, okay. And it's just one of those things that I started reading, and I was like, oh, that is true. Like that, because you don't, we, like how do we understand color versus how those in the past understood color, especially when you're looking at, globally, looking at indigenous cultures. Like color was always something that was there. It's sort of the reflecting of how, the world that they saw. And even when you think of those marble Greek and Roman statues, when we go into museums now, they're like these marble colored statues, but in actuality, when they were made, they were painted and they were colorful. And why was that removed? And now we're presented with these ideas these sculptures as being these you know, monoliths of natural color versus how they were intended to be actually are, and how, you know, the role of the museum of sort of perpetuating this idea of what they were rather than what they actually were.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
I've also been thinking a lot about color, because I guess I was mining that archive of childhood drawings recently.
Mhm.
It was like my childhood drawings are so colorful, and it's just like so unafraid, like the number of colors that are used at the same time. I'm just like, and it works. Like
Mhm.
I had a kind of fluency with myself, and it's interesting when I was like trying to make the installations out of those drawings, I noticed that I was now lacking the fluency with color. Like,
That is something that is covered in this book. It's like,
wow.
it talks about, you know, how how like how children view color as not something that's, I'm paraphrasing, but it's not something that is an object. It's not something that covers or masks an object. They see through it. Their imaginations allow them to fall into it, and it's something that as you become an adult, you some people lose.
Right.
And it's sort of, this book is questioning, you know, why is that? Why do we go from being these little humans who are going through the using the entire coloring box to, you know, we're sort of forced into coloring in the lines. You know, it reminds me of when I was in standard 1 in Trinidad. We had to bring in these drawings of dogs and we were supposed to paint them, but I was like, the colors. And I just remember, like, I was in the line, outside the line, I was using all the colors. I was like enjoying myself. And I remember my teacher, she came up and she's like, "What are you doing?" And she held my drawing up and she was like, "What did," like, she almost made fun of me. And I was like, "But why are we given all these colors if we only can draw within the line or draw it a specific way? Like,
Right.
you know, why is that taken away from us and we're told to sort of interact with in very specific ways?" And I think it's interesting
Yeah.
how
Why should you exist inside of the limits of her adult imagination? You know?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's wild that, you know, how we lose that freedom, and it's sort of become something we hesitate with, or color has become sort of a signifier for so many things that you can't just use them freely as we would possibly naturally want to. And I don't know, I find it interesting, there's, I can't remember, there's a painter from DC and he used to do these canvas paintings, and there's like the DC color field. I think that was the name of the group he was a part of. But he would do these canvas drawings where he would just lay color on it and just sort of, I think he would manipulate the the um the canvas, and it become like these fields of color. And it just sort of, you look at artists and sort of how, especially with painting, how it sort of became like this very um like not formal in a way, but very formal. It's sort of like this breaking down of painting that happens. And I wonder, like, how does that sort of breaking down or taking away or piece, like how you do in your own work, like you take away parts and then you put it back in, like how could we do that with color, and how could we sort of have color and sort of um subvert the viewer's understanding of what they're seeing. Like, I think at the end of the day, what I one of the things I hope to achieve through the way how I make is that I I want there to be a reflection of the anxiety that I feel is underlying to a lot of my existence in the spaces that I occupy, of, you know, understanding and being like, ooh, something here is not like something is not, like, you can't put your finger on it. Everything looks normal, but you're like, it's like that,
Like a dissonance.
yeah, something like that. I was, because when we go into art spaces and we when we look at going to museums, like, these are spaces that sort of tell us how things should always look. And I very much want to figure out how my work can operate in a way in which you're never sure if the thing you are looking at is true, and like to always question what you're seeing
Mm.
and never take it as what you're told it is. But I don't know if that's like a sign, a result of like the existence I live, or the world I'm occupying right now, because there's so much we're told, and there's so many other factors that go into what's presented to you. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
um
I remember in our first conversation, you kind of mentioning your decision to like not show the loom with the piece, to show them separately, to kind of like not connect the dots for people, let people kind of connect the dots on their own, or like be a little confused, or be
mhm.
with that certain something that you're pointing to.
Yeah, yeah, because it's hard, because the way the the tool is necessary for the object to be made, but the making on the tool, it's uh, it's something that it's not fixed. Like, everything about the tool, everything about this way of making, nothing is truly fixed in a way that we think it is. Everything is moving. There's so many moving parts. The tool is something that can grow, can contract on itself, and the objects are made in tension for the most part. And once that tension is removed, it's like there's so many parts to what this object becomes at the end. I struggle with thinking about how to show both, because the tool doesn't reveal how the object is made. And and I sort of question, is it necessary to have it with the object? I could just have the parts and just have the objects, and sort of this going back to culture and the expectations of culture, and sort of wondering, we all sort of are like these plants that our culture is this framework that we grow that help us sort of form us into who we are. And what happens when that is taken away, and they both have to exist separately. And I'm trying to understand, because of where I am right now, I'm sort of, everything is smaller, and sort of like it's become sort of a process of um technique, and seeing what happens when I do different techniques on this tool. And I truly wonder, because these objects, they're not fixed. So when they're sent to someone, or someone sees them to sort of interact or put it up on their wall, I'm always interested in how other people put it on the wall, especially when there's no clear indicator of what is top, what is front, what is back. And I'm hoping in the future to sort of get into a space where I I feel the need to I don't know how this is going to happen, but to because of the dimensionality of these woven objects, I want to destroy the wall, but like I want the space to sort of have to conform to them in a way that is like it cannot be denied, in a way that you know, culture, because I think I just keep hopscotching, but the thought I've had that all this sort of center is just sort of like how culture exists within the context of America. And when you think of how, you know, we have this baseline of how we are in our everyday, and then there's these moments where people come together to celebrate their culture, whether it's St. Patrick's Day or um, Brooklyn Carnival or the Puerto Rican Day, or these things that just happen in these moments and then they just dissipate and then they go away, and the spaces exist, but they sort of, people are able to for a moment occupy them, and then it's like they were never there. And that's how I sort of think of these tools, and the loom is sort of like it occupies for a moment and it sort of takes up space and it contracts and all these things happen, but then it's gone. But you know, like these celebrations, like the memory exists, like the feeling of it exists through whatever objects is left after. And sort of like I sometimes think of these objects as sort of like these manipulated archives of these woven tools, because you know they're manipulated, they're made on the tool, but manipulation happens once they're off the tool. And it's just sort of the idea of like these objects that exist in museums, they've been manipulated in some way, whether it's through our understanding of what they are or what they actually are. And like how, you know, how do you contextualize that within making, in, you know, this process of making? Because, you know, textiles in terms of how it's situated within the context of, you know, art making within museums and stuff like that. It's, you know, there was a push by major artists in the 60s to sort of, the history of textiles in terms of everything is very complicated, but in the 60s, you know, there were a group of artists that came out and they were like, they want to reject the past of textile making and sort of become this narrative of making that sort of spoke to other things, and they were sort of denied the spaces that they wanted to create by others who were in the traditional arts, like the paintings and the sculptures and so forth. And now there's sort of like a re-acceptance within the canon of art of fiber art. And it's, but the thing about it is like, it's still spoken of in terms of other ways of making, in terms of painting. And, you know, you spoke of like the language, like wanting to develop a language to sort of speak to the things that you're making. And, you know, it's my hope that textiles and fiber will sort of be allowed to sort of develop their own language that makes sense to how and what they make. And I think right now it's like there's a lot of making in context to what has happened before, but these ways of making are so new that we haven't been really able to have the space to develop the language. And what is the language that we will develop to speak about these things? And I think, you know, that is what many people within textiles and fiber are trying to figure out. But, you know, it's something that only time, it's something that you have to build over time. It's not going to happen overnight. So yeah.
Well, I feel like your practice is such a wonderful expression of that kind of journey of trying to find the language. So
yeah,
should we keep going? Or
yeah, I was just going to say, this is just unbelievably fascinating listening to the two, and I haven't wanted to interrupt. I want to make sure that if anybody does have questions, I think people would probably love to just keep hearing you talk, but we know you don't want to talk all night either. So I don't know where you are and what you had planned, both of you. But we'd love to hear any questions that anybody has. You can certainly just, you can put them in the chat, but you can also just ask. I'm still thinking a lot about what you were talking about with color, and and you touched on it, and just curious about sort of individual choices in your work in color, like kind of why the natural color. I know Latrelle, I've heard you talk about carnival in Trinidad and Tobago being a big influence. And I guess it's just sort of my perception, whether it's right or wrong, that, intense color would be a part of that. Yet your work is based on these very neutral and, to me, very beautifully neutral colors. And Mojdeh, I've noticed in like a lot of your installations, there might be a particular, I don't know, color, that kind of carries it, blue, kind of carrying throughout a particular installation, or yellow. And, imagining there's an autobiographical element to that as well. I don't know if that's something you can, address. And it's something I'm curious about.
Well, for me, the thing is, Carnival, I feel for me, that's one of the things that kept on happening with a lot of my earlier weaving work, in which I used a lot of color. I would bead into the work. And I felt that what I was trying to do, like, that is something that Carnival is something, even though it happens in the States, it happens in different cities. That was sort of something that was very site specific for me, in terms of it's something that's happening in Trinidad. And the work I was making was more in relation to where I am now. And while it's a major part of how, sort of like a major junction in which the work grew out of, I felt that until I got to a point where I could be truly, I don't think colors, I've made stuff with color, and I've made stuff with metallics, but I think in the future, a lot of my thinking is gonna be, there's gonna be not a major use of color in the work as of right now for me, because I want the objects to sort of exist in a way, of how we understand objects from different cultures outside of our own. And I think the lack of color sort of will tie into a lot of the things that I'm thinking of and I'm trying to like suss out. Yeah.
It also feels like you're setting a boundary,
Mhm.
with the sharing space.
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah.
I'm doing neutral colors at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, like, it's connected to kind of being in conversation and collaboration with my child self. Again, the installations being monochromatic, it happened also just organically. I'd signed up to do this installation that I thought was like a fifth of the size that it was. It's like an entire lobby of a building. And I went in and I was like, wow, do I even have enough work total to fill this room? It was a few years ago. And so I started to kind of group the pieces that I had, and instinctually just was working on them in groupings of like one pronounced color. So it was like blue and then reds and then yellows. And throughout when I noticed that I was doing that, I remembered that actually when I was, playing with Legos with my little brother, he would always make fun of me because, we'd sit down to play. And at first I had to organize everything by color first, like separate all the pieces and organize them by color. And then maybe I wouldn't even play. So it's like in doing this work that is attempting to kind of heal my child self backwards through time, I was arriving at natural tendencies I had as a child. So it's like, it was kind of like a um, marker of how the healing was working in a way. And so yeah, so that's how, and I really enjoyed the blue for some reason. I really just really enjoyed the blue. And I find myself really resistant also, I think similar to you, Latrelle, of like connecting the colors to like something in my culture. Like even if like to other people it does feel like that, I don't know. It's like, yeah, everyone can feel what they want to feel, but I'm not trying to make a cultural statement. I'm just playing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any other questions, or are there things that you had planned to talk about? I mean, I know it's just about 7 o'clock, so we don't want to keep you beyond what you signed up for. But just want to make sure.
Julia.
Oh,
yeah. Hi.
Julie, sorry.
Yeah, so I think this was really interesting, especially because I just came from a museum finally today where we were within a modern art exhibit that we had to more so interact with. I also have my sister-in-law from Zambia. So Latrelle, the poem that you wrote about the diaspora really struck with me. And also hearing about your project with the different pieces that were assumed to be Iranian, but really could have come from different parts of the Middle East, or, parts geopolitically of this different cultures. But I guess the question I'm interested in is in making this work and having these collaborations, right? Is your interest, especially when you were talking about the ways that people presume that these were all one objects, or these were all certain colors that could be used or not, are you creating these more for yourselves to solidify the culture that you come from and who you are? Or are you setting out more to educate us too on our assumptions about other people's cultures? And I know you women show all over the globe, right? So I'm not assuming one way or another, but in terms of this, like, obviously it seems like that there's always the bigger artistic institution or the educational institution that has already prescribed something, and your use of textiles, you're building looms, you're using the different, going even in your thesis, right? And trying to really integrate yourself with people rather than change around it or change their environment around your ideas. Is that something that you're also trying to show us as your viewer, or as the person who is interpreting and taking in your art? Does that make sense in any way?
I think what you're trying to ask is, correct me if I'm wrong, what is the response maybe we want from those who are viewing the work?
Great, that's much simpler.
I think for me personally, the making, I'm trying, intuitively, I have a question that I'm trying to answer. And as I'm trying to answer this question that keeps on reforming itself in different ways. I feel that I'm trying to figure something out, and when I present them, I'm trying to see if these answers that I've come to, do they make sense once are they performing in a way that I expect them to perform in? I think with art and object making, once they're out in the world, I would hope that the viewers would understand that this is a journey for me, and they are participants along with myself in sort of the discovery of where this work is going. Even though I'm the maker, I'm making these objects, I'm not the end. I don't know where the end point is, but I know that I'm working towards it. And the part of the viewer is sort of to bear witness to these objects and to these things, and to hold memory of what they were, even though they are changing. So, and to sort of be aware, like it goes back to time and how like we're not aware of time moving, but we know that it's happening, and sort of they're sort of the witnessing of sort of these moments that are happening, and they're going to link and understand how all these things come together, even though they're not there at every point. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, same in some ways, you know. I think that the piece is incomplete without the experience of whoever kind of like takes it in, you know. That's kind of part of it too. And I definitely don't make work to educate. But I find myself kind of weary and like resistant to sharing certain bodies of my work that are like too autobiographical or like too much about like my past trauma or something inside of art contexts, institutional contexts, which like tend to be like very white contexts. And because I feel like traumas are too often like fetishized kind of. And I also like, instead of just like not showing any of that at all, now I'm coming back around with this project with the fragments of like creating a container for everyone to feel good kind of tending to those parts of their practice, because like I'm holding it inside of the institutional context, or like, yeah, like there's some sort of like a cushion or a claiming of space. And yeah.
Thank you. You were far more eloquent than I attempted to be. These were interesting answers. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the question.
Anyone else? Latrelle and Mojdeh, the pairing of the two of you was, I have to say, based on just a gut feeling. I don't know, I can't explain it, but it was just a gut. And from my perspective, this couldn't have been better. I mean, I hope it was as enjoyable for the two of you to get to know each other and to have this conversation as it was for us to listen to you, you know, in conversation. I hope that we all can continue to keep conversations going. And I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, this was wonderful, really, 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 really brilliant, really wonderful to listen to the two of you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Latrelle, and yeah, to be here with everyone. Thanks for being here.
It was a true pleasure. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone who attended. This was really, really awesome. Thank you for taking the time, for spending a little while with us. I appreciate it.
And we all appreciate it as well. This is recorded, so it will be shortly, you know, probably a couple of days up on our website to watch it again. And, you know, for, you know, hopefully those that haven't had the chance tonight to watch it, it will be available forever. So thank you.
Certainly will.
Thank you.
There's
so
a lot
much.
I'd like to revisit in your conversations that you had tonight and really think more about too. So thank you very much, ladies.
I agree, Julie. I'm going to be listening to it many times.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
You.
Have a good night.
Bye.